Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11-2H4, the committee announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today, we meet to consider S-141, the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act, and H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessment Act. And I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we meet to consider two bills primarily referred to the Science Committee. One is S-141, the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act. The committee will consider an amendment in the nature of a substitute by Representative Perlmutter as base text. The Perlmutter-Brooks substitute requires the establishment of roles and responsibilities for federal agencies within the nation's space weather enterprise. It codifies a formal approach to assessing and addressing the challenges posed by space weather in the areas of observation, forecasting, and response. Broadly speaking, space weather is the way the behavior of the sun and the nature of the Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere interact. Space weather can affect the modern technology we rely upon daily. The electric grid, oil pipelines, passengers on commercial airlines, and satellites that provide telecommunications and GPS services can all be impacted by space weather. Depending on the severity of the event, these impacts could prove disastrous. As with terrestrial weather, without thorough monitoring and accurate modeling, we simply have no good way to predict space weather events and, in turn, no ability to ensure that life and property are protected if severe events occur. While the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the U.S. Air Force currently monitor space weather, issue forecasts, and create other products to inform the public, space weather science as a discipline is still in its early stages. Without marked improvements in understanding the causes of space weather, led by NASA, and the ability to more accurately forecast and predict events, much of our modern technological infrastructure is at risk. The Perlmutter-Brooks substitute creates, for the first time, a formal national framework to leverage the capabilities and expertise of the government, commercial sector, academic community, and international partners. By tasking the National Space Council with overseeing this framework, this amendment sets out a strategy that is consistent with the current administration's approach to the management of space issues and raises the profile of space weather and the serious threat it poses. Additionally, this amendment codifies the reality of the threat posed by space weather and requires the establishment and maintenance of a baseline capability for space weather observation and forecasting. However, through the creation of a pilot program for the purchase of space weather data and services from the commercial sector, the substitute also ensures that innovative, cost-effective strategies can be pursued. And our burgeoning commercial space industry can help address the challenges posed by space weather. The Perlmutter-Brooks Amendment will help us better prepare for, respond to, and recover from potential space weather events. The other bill is H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, introduced by Environment Subcommittee Chairman Andy Biggs and co-sponsored by Committee Vice Chairman Lucas, Environment Subcommittee Vice Chairman Norman, and Representatives Rohrabacher, Posey, Weber, Babin, Higgins, Lesko, Holtgren, Abraham, Webster, Marshall, and Dunn. This legislation amends the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Act to require any chemical hazard identification and dose response assessments previously conducted by the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS program, to be carried out by the relevant national program offices within the EPA. Since 2009, the Government Accountability Office and the National Academy of Sciences have raised multiple reports criticizing the IRIS program for a lack of transparency, procedural flaws, and improper science. This committee held a hearing last September examining many of these problems and learning more about their impact on industry. Committee staff have held 2 briefings with the EPA to learn more about the practices and procedures of the IRIS program. Although much work has been done in recent years to address shortcomings in the program, the results just aren't there. The time is right for an overhaul to bring the chemical assessment process at EPA back to its core mission of conducting complete and transparent scientific research as the foundation for regulatory decisions. This bill does just that by making agency science more useful to EPA program offices while increasing transparency and efficiency in the conduct of chemical assessments. H.R. 6468 requires the EPA to follow strict scientific standards in conducting hazard identification and dose response assessments. The bill requires the EPA to ensure the underlying scientific data is complete, relevant, and reproducible. It also explicitly requires the EPA to integrate all lines of scientific evidence, a suggestion made by the National Academies of Sciences in 2014. The EPA Office of Research and Development must certify that each chemical assessment completed by the relevant program offices meets the scientific standards in the legislation. Together, these improvements will increase the public's confidence in the EPA's chemical toxicity assessments by ensuring they are conducted using the best available science and are based on the weight of the evidence. Taken together, the two bills we consider today prioritize key programs and vital reforms within the Science Committee's jurisdiction. Though I should mention that the second bill also has joint jurisdiction with the Energy Committee, as John Shumkus just reminded me on the House floor a few minutes ago. I'll now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to everyone. Today we are marking up two bills, the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act and the Improving Science and Chemical Assessment Act. Before I speak on the specifics of the bills, I again want to take a moment to comment on the committee's dramatic turn away from regular order. This markup was noticed on Friday afternoon when we left all Thursday, well after most members were out of town. Moreover, since the markup is on a Tuesday, the amendment deadline was 2 p.m. on Monday, which is before most members are back in Washington. This hardly seems conducive to a member participation in the markup. Then on Saturday afternoon, another bill was added to the markup. This may be the least amount of notice I've ever received on a bill being marked up in the Science Committee. In fact, until last Congress, this would have broken the long-standing committee notice requirements. However, Chairman Smith changed the rules to allow weekend days to count toward the notice requirements. On top of these issues, our committee rarely holds legislative hearings, and we haven't held a subcommittee markup in years. Bills are concocted in secret and thrown at the committee members with no real chance for meaningful review. The result is that members are disenfranchised and the work of this committee suffers. We can do better than this. The first bill up is the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act. I will speak more about this in a minute when we consider it. However, I want to note how ridiculous it is to jam the members of this committee by noticing this bill over the weekend. The bill we are marking up, S-141, was introduced in January of 2017. It was referred to our committee in May of 2017, which is well over a year ago. Mr. Perlmutter's companion bill was introduced in June of 2017. We could have considered these bills at any point in the past year instead of jamming the members of this committee with a late markup notice. This bill has been referred to 4 additional House committees, so I suspect it is going nowhere in a hurry. In fact, it seems like this entire markup is a complete waste of our members' time. The next bill we're marking up is a good example of the silliness that ensues when the committee engages in these half-baked markups. We were supposed to mark this bill up last week. However, the majority had to pull the bill when it wasn't even referred to our committee. So here we are again. The bill appears to have been hastily drafted in secret without getting any feedback from the affected agencies or the affected community. On top of being sloppily drafted and poorly vetted, this bill is just plain bad. The bill would remove chemical assessments from EPA's IRIS program and shift them to the separate program offices within the agency. Essentially, it is shutting down IRIS without explicitly saying so. The end result, perhaps surprisingly, is that the chemical assessments will be delayed and of worse quality than under the IRIS program. Ultimately, though, my greatest concern is the harm that will come to the Americans if these chemical assessments are undermined. That is why the bill is opposed by the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Environmental Defense Fund. They have written letters to the committee expressing their opposition, and I ask that they may be made part of the record. This really is a bad bill that will ultimately result in bad science and sick people. I urge all of my colleagues to oppose it. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I'll recognize myself for a minute. I just want to give members a complete picture about why we had a weekend notice of particularly the weather bill. Other members can respond to the merits or demerits of the bills and the substance of the bills. But the bill that we talked about over the weekend, and I talked to Mr. Perlmutter about it at least once or twice, and we exchanged other messages. I talked to Senator Peters about the space weather bill over the weekend, and we exchanged several messages. And this was all in an effort to try to keep, frankly, a commitment I made to Mr. Perlmutter and the senator to mark up this bill before we broke for our August recess. So we bent over backwards over the weekend to make sure that we were ready for markup. And I'm a little surprised to hear the ranking member complain about a Democratic bill into which we put in a lot of effort so that we would be prepared to mark it up today. So I just want, again, members to have a full picture of the space weather bill and why that weekend notice was necessary. Pursuant to notice, I now call up S-141, the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
S-141, an act to improve understanding and forecasting of space weather events and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and we will now proceed with consideration of amendments in the order listed on the roster, and I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. And does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to Senate Bill 141 at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to S-141 offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number ANS-01.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am very pleased we're here today to finally mark up legislation on space weather, and the ranking member is correct. This subject has been hanging around now for at least a year. Space weather is electromagnetic activity from the sun. It's radiation, it's flares, it's eruptions, and it can have significant societal, economic, national security, and health implications both here on Earth as well as in space. Almost 3 years ago, Dr. Dan Baker from the University of Colorado Boulder testified in front of this committee about the dangers of space weather events on our electrical grid. At that hearing, he said, had an observed July 2012 space weather event actually hit the Earth, we would still be picking up the pieces. That testimony stuck with me, and when Senators Gary Peters and Cory Gardner introduced the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act a few months later, I was eager to start working on a House companion bill. Last year's Senate Bill 141 passed the Senate by unanimous consent, and I introduced the House companion with a few additions to that text with then Representative Jim Bridenstine as my Republican co-sponsor. Since last summer, I've been reminding and bugging the chairman of my interest in the topic and calling for a hearing, and good to his word, we had that hearing in April, and I thought all of the members who participated in that hearing were engaged and interested in taking action. After that hearing in April, I worked with Chairman Smith and my new lead Republican co-sponsor, Representative Mo Brooks, to agree on legislative text the chairman could support and which moves the ball forward on this subject. That is the text reflected in my amendment today. This legislation will better coordinate federal research investments with forecasters who provide warnings to affected industries and to ensure the academic community and commercial sector work hand in hand to improve space weather forecasting. This text takes a different approach about how to meet these goals than the Senate-passed bill, but with this shared goal in mind, it is another step towards getting space weather legislation signed into law this year. This amendment builds upon the work done in 2015 under the Obama administration and tasks the National Space Council and a newly created National Committee for Space Weather Observation and Forecasting with developing our national space weather priorities. It also requires the Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop a national space weather research roadmap to coordinate federal research on space weather. We found in the hearing showed that the commercial sector, the academic sector, and the federal sector were all working kind of in silos and not collaborating in the way that would best serve all of us as Americans. Throughout the bill, federal agencies will be required to collaborate more with the academic community and the commercial sector, one of the driving factors behind the legislation. The bill also sets up formal mechanisms to help break down barriers between the research community and operational forecasters by encouraging sharing of information and requirements to improve the pipeline of new observations, technologies, models, and forecasts. Today's markup is certainly not the end of the conversation. There were multiple referrals, and one of the desires, and I think is accomplished by the substitute, is to eliminate some, if not all, of the referrals. Over the coming months, we will all have to work together. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, Representative Brooks, along with the Senators Peters, Gardner, Thune, and Nelson from the Senate Commerce Committee. I'm confident we can take the two versions of this legislation and agree on a final text which will pass the House and the Senate to be signed into law later this year. I look forward to this continued dialogue and the input we'll receive from the space weather community in the coming months. I want to thank Representative Brooks for his help and for Chairman Smith for working with me. I'd also like to thank the Ranking Member for her support of H.R. 3086 and strong collaborative legislation on space weather. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized for his comments on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this legislation and the Perlmutter-Brooks amendment in the nature of a substitute up for committee consideration today. Space weather is an important issue because the consequences of a severe space weather event can be far-reaching and disastrous. The Perlmutter-Brooks amendment helps to establish a formal space weather observation and forecasting architecture that, hopefully, will help mitigate the harmful consequences of space weather to life and property on Earth and in space. Space weather is a collection of physical processes beginning at the sun with solar winds and ultimately affecting human activities on Earth and in space. Solar winds and their interaction with Earth's atmosphere are not as understood as they should be. Fortunately, numerous people and organizations are changing this. Scientists and engineers at Marshall Space Flight Center in my district have been at the forefront of this vital research for many years. Under the Perlmutter-Brooks amendment, their research will not only continue, but improve so as to help advance the nation's space weather knowledge to where it needs to be. I thank my colleague, Mr. Perlmutter, for the leadership on this space weather and his partnership on this amendment. I urge my colleagues to vote for it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks, and I'll recognize myself to speak on the amendment as well. And first of all, I want to thank Mr. Perlmutter and Mr. Brooks for their hard work on this issue and urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan substitute to S-141. Their initiative for the safety and security of the American people and economy is welcomed. The Perlmutter-Brooks amendment in the nature of a substitute will further the goals of S-141 and better address the complex challenges posed by space weather and space weather events. By establishing a national coordinating framework and providing ways for the commercial sector, academic community, and international partners to contribute in innovative, meaningful, and cost-saving ways, the amendment not only advances space weather observation and forecasting capabilities, but also increases the vigor of the national space enterprise on the whole. Again, I especially appreciate Mr. Perlmutter's efforts to move this legislation forward. Does the gentleman from Colorado seek to be recognized again? With no objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I have, I think this is where I do it. I have an amendment to the substitute amendment.
If you'll give me 10 seconds, we're on the way there. The next amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. And I know the gentleman seeks to be recognized, and he is so recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the substitute amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the Perlmutter amendment in the nature of a substitute to S-141 offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 002.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain that amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the ranking member was correct. Things were moving very quickly this weekend with conversations between me and the chairman, Senators Gardner and Peters, about the the changes that we have proposed in the substitute amendment. And we've got a couple other changes to the bill text that we worked on over the weekend. So in addition, there are technical changes to the amendment that will ensure that NOAA, NASA, and the NSF support both basic and applied research to improve the space weather forecasting. The amendment that I'm proposing now also requires the priorities and plans under the bill to be reevaluated and updated at least every 4 years or more frequently as deemed necessary by the administration. The amendment also makes clear the importance of space weather data and forecasting to successful deep space exploration, which was suggested by Representative Brooks and is clearly a very important facet of the space weather legislation we're proposing. I encourage all my colleagues to support the amendment to the substitute amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. And the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I support the manager's amendment to the Perlmutter-Brooks amendment in the nature of a substitute. This amendment brings common sense additions to the Perlmutter-Brooks amendment. One in particular merits emphasis. In explicitly outlining the importance of space weather observation and forecasting to deep space exploration, this manager's amendment makes it clear that not only can space weather impact us on the terrestrial frontier, Earth, but it can and will impact us in deep space exploration as well. I encourage my colleagues to vote for the manager's amendment as well as the underlying Perlmutter-Brooks amendment in the nature of a substitute to Senate S. 141. I yield back.
And thank you, Mr. Brooks. And the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not oppose this manager's amendment. However, it is worth noting that we apparently need a 3-page manager's amendment to perfect an amendment in the nature of a substitute that was noticed 3 days ago. This just reinforces my opinion that our committee has rushed to a markup of a poorly vetted piece of legislation. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we recognize the enormous impact that the sun has on the Earth. And today we're focusing, of course, on the powerful danger that any type of hiccup on the sun could cause enormous damage here. Let us just note the sun also, many of us believe, has is the deciding factor as to what our climate will be like on the Earth, and that this impact should not be ignored when we are debating the various issues that come before this committee, and I just thought I would point out how important the sun is. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The last amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Zettie Bernice Johnson of Texas to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, amendment number 035.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the ranking member is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is very straightforward. The text of this amendment is drawn from the Bipartisan Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act, H.R. 3086. This bill was introduced by my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, and I was the original co-sponsor. It was also co-sponsored by current NASA Administrator, Mr. Jim Bridenstine, before he left the House. The legislation was drafted in a bipartisan fashion with minority committee staff involvement, unlike the amendment in the nature of a substitute being offered today by Mr. Perlmutter that neither I nor the staff saw until negotiations had already been completed. This bill builds on the Senate-passed space weather legislation that we are marking up today with some additional improvements. These improvements include strengthening international, commercial, and academic collaboration and research to operations activities, incorporation of the National Academy's decadal survey recommendation, and providing for research in behavioral, economic, and social sciences for the improved national preparedness for space weather events. In particular, this bill directs NOAA Administrator to enter into an agreement with the National Academies to establish a Space Weather Government Industry University Roundtable to bring the various stakeholders together to facilitate communication and the transfer of knowledge, language that was widely supported by the community. Many groups are supportive of H.R. 3086, including academia, scientific societies, and the commercial sector. I'd like to contrast this amendment with the amendment in the nature of a substitute notice this past Saturday. The text of my amendment has been vetted by the outside community for well over a year, versus 3 days for the ANS. In fact, my staff found out that NOAA Legislative Affairs had not even been given a copy of the ANS until we reached out to them yesterday afternoon. NOAA is one of the agencies most affected by this bill. Our committee held a hearing on space weather in April, where H.R. 3086 was endorsed by the expert witnesses. We've had no hearings on the ANS because we've only just received it. My amendment also more closely resembles Senator Peters' Senate companion bill, which has already received unanimous support from the other body. All of this suggests that my amendment represents a better and more rigorous thought-out policy choice than the ANS notice this past weekend. Given the Senate's prior support of S-141, I think adopting my amendment would also make it more likely that we can actually get a good bill enacted into law, which should be our goal as legislators. I think we ought to be supporting the best policy in this committee, and I hope my colleagues will do that today and support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I'll recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. On April 26th, the subcommittees on Environment and Space held a hearing titled Surveying the Space Weather Landscape, in which members learned about the potential negative impacts of space weather events and the current state of research, forecasting, and preparedness efforts related to space weather. The committee's position was always that more knowledge was needed before acting legislatively, and consideration of today's legislation, which comes just over 3 months after the initial April hearing, is entirely consistent with that position. Shortly after the April 26 hearing, Mr. Perlmutter began moving the ball forward on space weather legislation in a constructive, bipartisan manner. Mr. Perlmutter and his staff undertook proactive, good-faith negotiations and worked closely with the committee in crafting the consensus text of the Perlmutter-Brooks Amendment before us today. The Perlmutter-Brooks Amendment, in the nature of a substitute, is a culmination of a rigorous, bipartisan negotiation and represents a substantive, good-faith effort to address a serious issue. The amendment offered by the ranking member would reject those efforts, so I encourage my colleagues to vote against this amendment. Anyone else seek to be recognized? The gentleman from Colorado.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I can't dispute the ranking member's complaint that things really did accelerate over the course of the last few weeks. But on the other hand, we have been negotiating. My office has been negotiating with the chairman and the committee staff. We've been working on this. It really accelerated, all of us really accelerated over the weekend. Much of what's in House Resolution 3086 is in the substitute amendment, and there still is a long way to go to resolve this. And I appreciate the critiques by the ranking member, and I like 3086 better than my substitute amendment. But reality is that this is what we agreed on, and this is what I agreed on with Representative Brooks and with the chairman and with Senator Peters, so that we could advance this legislation and have it go through further conversation and negotiation as it goes through the process. So I like my bill, but I'll probably have to vote against it because I agreed on this substitute motion.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter, for those comments. Does anyone else seek to be recognized? If not, we have a series of amendments to vote on. And if there are no further amendments, the question is on agreeing to the manager's amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question is now on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member, Ms. Johnson. All in favor say aye.
Record vote, please.
I understand. Record vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas? No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Rohrabacher? No. Mr. Rohrabacher votes no. Mr. Brooks? No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren? No. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Weber? No. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Knight? No. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin? No. Mr. Babin votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Abraham? Mr. Palmer? Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes no. Thank you. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Marshall? No. Mr. Marshall votes no. Mr. Dunn? No. Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mrs. Lesko? No. Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Cloud? Ms. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson votes yes. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes yes. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes yes. Ms. Bonamici? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes yes. Ms. Esti? Ms. Esti votes yes. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes yes. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes yes. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen votes yes. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb votes yes. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes yes. Mr. Perlmutter?
Pass.
Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes yes. Mr. Foster? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes yes. Ms. Hanabusa? Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ votes yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members voted aye, 19 members voted nay.
The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. All in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report S-141 to the House is amended with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting S-141 to the House as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and S-141 as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. S-141 is amended is ordered reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 6468, a bill to direct that certain assessments with respect to toxicity of chemicals be carried out by the program offices of the Environmental Protection Agency and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll recognize myself to speak on the legislation. Today, we are considering a bill that restores the scientific integrity of chemical toxicity assessments being conducted by the EPA. H.R. 6468 ensures that chemical hazard identification and dose response assessments will be transparent, complete, and tailored to the regulatory needs of EPA program offices. And I want to thank Chairman Biggs for his hard work on this legislation and urge my colleagues to support this bill. And the bill's sponsor, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized to speak on the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak on behalf of my bill, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act. This legislation ensures that chemical assessments conducted by the EPA will advance the agency's core mission of protecting human health and the environment. Specifically, the bill will eliminate EPA's flawed Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, and return the responsibility of conducting hazard identification and dose response assessments to EPA's program offices, which are best situated to perform the work. Without any foundation in law or direction from Congress, EPA administratively created the IRIS program in 1985 to foster consistency in chemical assessments conducted by EPA. Unfortunately, IRIS has evolved into a program plagued by inefficiencies and a lack of transparency, resulting in questionable science that can have a significant impact on the marketplace. When IRIS assigns a toxicity value to a chemical, federal, state, and local regulatory authorities use it to make rules and regulations that can impact commerce. While in practice the program does not have any regulatory authority, the assessments produced by the program can still have a negative impact on the economy, similar to the effect of regulation. Over the past year, the Environment Subcommittee has conducted a hearing, hosted briefings with the EPA, met with stakeholders, and worked with our colleagues to learn more about the IRIS program. It has become very apparent that the program has lost its way. This bill will address the problems of the program by ensuring that any future chemical assessments performed are tailored to the regulatory need of the relevant EPA program office. Let me be clear. Chemical toxicity assessments will still be performed by the agency. They will just be performed by the program offices rather than IRIS. These future assessments will be stored in a publicly accessible chemical assessment database, which will also retain the existing IRIS assessments. Most importantly, this legislation promotes reliability in chemical hazard identification and dose response assessments by ensuring they will be carried out using the best available science and based on the weight of the scientific evidence. The bill requires that the EPA meet stringent scientific standards when assessing any given chemical by considering the relevance of the data, the uncertainty in scientific information, the extent to which it has been peer-reviewed, and whether the findings are reproducible. Lastly, the bill creates a Chemical Hazard Identification and Dose Response Steering Committee, chaired by the Office of Research and Development to prevent duplication of work performed by the program offices. The steering committee will also be authorized to consider third-party assessments as a supplement to the work being performed by the program offices, provided that the third-party assessments meet the scientific standards which are outlined in this bill. The Chemical Assessment Improvement Act is a common-sense effort to refocus EPA science back to its core mission. I thank Chairman Smith, Vice Chairman Lucas, Environment Subcommittee Chairman Norman, Representatives Rohrbacher, Posey, Weber, Babin, Higgins, Lesko, Hultgren, Abraham, Webster, Marshall, and Dunn for co-sponsoring this important legislation. I encourage the rest of my colleagues to support this bill. Mr. Chairman, I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from former Democrat Congressman Cal Dooley, the CEO of the American Chemistry Council, which represents more than 170 companies that do business in the field of chemistry, which supports the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act. This letter acknowledges that IRIS has had a, quote, routine lack of transparency in the program, as well as failures in efficiency and direction that have mired the credibility of the program, close quote. Furthermore, his letter asserts that the, quote, legislation will ensure that EPA's program offices conduct chemical assessments in a timely manner consistent with the best available science, close quote. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask that that letter be incorporated into the record.
Okay, with that objection, so ordered.
And I encourage my colleagues to vote for this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Biggs. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I strongly oppose the bill, which would decimate the IRIS program. The IRIS program provides human health assessments of chemicals found in our environment. The IRIS program has reviewed hundreds of chemicals and supports programs across the entire agency. This is an important program that keeps us safe. We should not be gutting it. We should be ensuring that it has the resources and staff to thrive and continue to provide toxicity information. It does not make sense to tear apart this program and ignore research expertise. By fragmenting the office, we would be creating a system where critical assessments would occur in other offices that lack the capacity and expertise to properly conduct these assessments. Instead, we would be giving an even louder voice to industry interests who would replace unbiased expertise. This would hurt public health and is a dangerous endeavor. On EPA's own website, it states the IRIS program is located within EPA's National Center for Environmental Assessment in the Office of Research and Development. The placement of the IRIS program in ORD is intentional. It ensures that IRIS can develop impartial toxicity information independent of its use by EPA's programs and regional offices to set national standards and clean up hazardous sites. I'm also concerned by the secret science language in the bill. This type of language is thinly veiled campaign to limit serious and highly credible scientific research that supports critical regulatory action. We also have seen a disturbing trend at EPA lately where science is being sidelined. I am extremely concerned by reports that the release of a study which detailed cancer risks from formaldehyde is being delayed with the results kept hidden from the public. EPA's priority must be to protect public health and the environment. Weakening the IRIS program will likely delay other critical toxicity assessments, and some may never see the light of day. In addition to my objections to the substance, I also have serious process concerns with this bill. Not only am I on this committee, I also serve as the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on the Environment. This bill meddles with existing regulatory and program requirements contained in the many public health statutes that EPA implements. These statutes are under the jurisdiction of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. I understand that the majority has not had substantive discussions with the staff of Energy and Commerce Committee about this bill to avoid unintentional, overlapping, or adverse consequences in law and regulation. Moreover, I am concerned by the process behind the first bill, H.R. 6399, the Chemical Assessments Improvement Act. That bill was introduced last Tuesday and noticed for a markup last Wednesday, but the House parliamentarian determined that the bill was entirely within the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee. The morning of the markup, the bill was abruptly pulled. Before this bill is considered, the following questions should be answered. 1, has the committee spoken with EPA and have formal comments from the agency on this bill been received? If so, will the majority please share them? 2, what other groups have been talked to about this bill? Can we see all the comments received from them on this bill? 3, what is the cost estimate of this bill? 4, what are the potential impacts of this bill on the programs and laws of EPA? I do not believe we should be marking up this legislation at all. I will oppose this legislation and encourage my colleagues to do the same. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. Are there other members who wish to be heard? Down here, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for bringing forward this critical piece of legislation. I applaud the efforts of the Environmental Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Biggs of Arizona, in introducing the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act to bring much-needed improvements to the way that EPA conducts dose-response chemical assessments. The mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment, and this legislation will further empower the agency to ensure that the assessments that it undertakes will do just that. The committee has heard for too long about the issues facing the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, program. In fact, the committee held a hearing in which many concerns regarding scientific integrity and a lack of transparency in IRIS process were raised. Similar concerns have also been raised by the National Academy of Sciences and the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Given the shortcomings of the current program, it is necessary to make improvements to the way that chemicals are chosen and assessed. This legislation will improve coordination amongst the national program offices and regional offices by establishing a much-needed steering committee. This committee will allow for chemicals to be appropriately selected for assessment, avoiding duplication and ensuring that they meet a regulatory need. Moreover, this legislation will ensure that EPA is using the best available science and rely on a weight of the scientific evidence approach when performing these assessments. Together with the common sense scientific standards further outlined in the bill, these principles will ensure greater certainty to the marketplace and to the American people. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I want to thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. And the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act because it would effectively eliminate the Integrated Risk Information System within the EPA's Office of Research and Development. The bill proposes a fragmented and weak system of conducting chemical assessments that would undermine the agency's mission to protect human health. The EPA created the IRIS back in 1985 to independently assess the toxicity of chemicals and to provide a consistent database of human health assessments of chemicals that are found in our environment. It was specifically placed within ORD, so those tasked with protecting the public's health are able to make the best independent decisions they can by using the best available science to determine the potential harmful effects of chemical exposures. The chemical assessment process requires advanced technical knowledge and expertise. Unfortunately, this bill would disperse the process across program offices within the EPA that do not have the scientific capacity to conduct the rigorous review required to provide a thorough chemical analysis. The bill would also allow for individual program offices to assign a range of toxicity values instead of a single toxicity value for chemical substances. This could allow regulated entities to essentially choose from a number of toxicity values that could lead to very disparate risk assessment decisions nationwide, and the consequences could be dangerous. I'm also disappointed that once again this committee chooses to ignore processes associated with an agency program. Both the National Academies and EPA's own Scientific Advisory Board, which is comprised of members selected by former Administrator Pruitt, have recently commended the IRIS program for its work conducting vital chemical assessments. In fact, the National Academies concluded that the EPA has been responsive to its previous recommendations regarding the IRIS program and has made substantial progress in their implementation. Also, this bill was not written in a bipartisan fashion and is a short-sighted attempt by our majority to restrict science and allow for industry influence. It is imperative that these chemical assessments be conducted, and the IRIS program should be placed in an impartial office like the ORD that has the scientific expertise required to provide critical toxicity information. Disassembling a program that relies on a science-based review process to conduct human health assessments and replacing it with a weakened substitute to placate industry is a disservice to the American public. I oppose this dangerous bill. I align myself with Mr. Tonko's concerns about the committee jurisdiction as well, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn, is recognized for his comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this important legislation markup, and thank you for your leadership on this, Chairman Biggs, introducing the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act. This bill addresses many concerns raised by the National Academy of Sciences and the Government Accountability Office regarding the Integrated Risk Program system, that's the IRIS program at EPA. Both the National Academy of Science and the GAO have been highly critical of the IRIS program and the process it uses to review chemicals. This bill improves the EPA's process for conducting these assessments. In order to make these important changes, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act will shift the responsibility of performing dose-response chemical assessments to the national program offices at the EPA. These offices require such assessments to fulfill statutory requirements. Moreover, the bill will codify the scientific principles that strengthen the quality of chemical assessments. Many of the scientific standards put forward in this legislation come directly from the EPA's own guidelines for undertaking assessments. These are common sense standards that position the EPA to better protect human health and the environment. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, I urge my colleagues to support this important bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. And the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized.
Well, I thank the chairman for yielding, or I move to strike the last word first.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for giving me a few minutes here. I'm going to oppose this purely partisan bill, H.R. 6468. Mr. Chairman, good legislation needs bipartisan input. We don't see that here. Second, I question the committee's jurisdiction. Again, repeating what Mr. Tonko said, ENC, Energy and Commerce, should be responsible to mark up this bill. And third, of the many problems with this bill, I will focus on the politicization and introduction of conflict of interest influences in the chemical assessment process, as well as the overall degradation in the quality of chemical assessments if this bill were to become law. H.R. 6468 sets up a steering committee that would be chaired by a political appointee and have the remainder of its membership appointed by the EPA administrator, creating a highly politicized body that would be responsible for determining which assessments are carried out and by which program office. Additionally, the steering committee would have the ability to include third-party assessments and to choose the author of these assessments, essentially rolling out the welcome mat for further politicization of what should be an inherently science-based process. Moving chemical assessments conducted by the IRS program out of the Office of Research and Development and into individual program offices at the EPA would allow for gaps in scientific review process. Program offices use the toxicity information generated by the IRIS program to set national standards and clean up hazardous sites. If only one program office is responsible for conducting an assessment on a given chemical, there's a danger that different routes of exposure could be ignored. For example, under this bill, if more than one program office intends to conduct an assessment on a chemical, the previously described steering committee would choose which program office would lead the chemical assessment. If this bill were to become law and a chemical assessment is needed to be conducted on lead, which program office would conduct it? If the Office of Air and Radiation took the lead, would it ignore the hazards of lead in water? Or if the Office of Water took charge, would it ignore the hazards of lead in the air? Chemicals found in our environment don't always follow only one route of exposure and can be found across various media such as air, water, and soil. Relegating a chemical assessment to one program office would introduce bias in a way the assessments are conducted and lead to lower quality assessments. This bill would ultimately endanger human health. Dividing up chemical assessments among program offices is a recipe for problems, as different routes of exposure to chemical hazards could be ignored or undervaluated and would allow for a bias to creep into these critical assessments. This is not acceptable for an agency charged with protecting human health. The IRS program provides vital toxicity information that is relied upon by states, tribes, regions, and other federal agencies, and they should continue to be housed in an impartial Office of Research and Development that has the appropriate scientific expertise and capacity. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill.
Thank you, Ms. McNerney. And the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for bringing this important legislation to a markup. And I also want to thank Environmental Subcommittee Chairman Andy Biggs for his leadership in sponsoring this Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, a bill that will increase transparency and efficiency in EPA's chemical toxicity assessment program. H.R. 6468 is designed to refocus EPA science on its core mission of protecting humans and protecting human health and the environment. One of the priorities of President Trump's EPA has been to ensure that agency science is useful and relevant. This bill will make chemical toxicity data relevant for the regulatory needs of the EPA program offices and useful for states and localities, which will continue to have access to the data through the publicly available Chemical Assessments Database. For years, the Internal Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, program has been unresponsive to National Programs Office needs. The assessments take years, sometimes a decade, to complete. Thus, by the time the assessments are complete, they're useless for the program offices, which must regulate within the statutory time limits. This legislation guarantees that chemical assessments will be conducted efficiently and will be valuable to national program offices to carry out their core functions. H.R. 6468 also creates a steering committee to coordinate functions and to prevent duplications of work among the program offices. EPA regional offices will sit on the steering committee and will thus continue to have a role in determining which assessments are needed for regulatory purposes. Furthermore, this steering committee will be allowed to consider third-party assessments performed by academia, outside scientific bodies, foreign agencies, and industry, provided that these third-party assessments meet the stringent scientific standards in the legislation. This will increase the efficiency of the chemical assessment process by allowing program officers to use these third-party assessments as supplements and build off the work already done by others. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 6468, the Improving Science and Chemical Assessments Act, I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. If there are no other amendments or reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 6468 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 6468 to the House. A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no.
I'm sorry. Thank you for looking up again. I was looking at Eddie Bernice Johnson. That's why I said no. I vote yes.
Mr. Smith votes yes. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Rohrabacher?
I vote no, but I'm going to change it to yes.
Mr. Rohrabacher votes yes. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes yes. Mr. Holtgren? Mr. Posey? Mr. Massey? Mr. Weber? Mr. Knight? Mr. Knight votes yes. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes yes. Mrs. Comstock? Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Abraham? Mr. Abraham votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Marshall? Mr. Marshall votes yes. Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes yes. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes yes. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko votes yes. Mr. Cloud? Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer votes no. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen votes no. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Hanabusa? Mr. Christ? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 17 members voted yes, 13 members voted no.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Now, with that objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 6468 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. With that objection, so ordered. There's no further discussion. That completes our business. This concludes the Science Committee markup. Without objection, the gentleman, Mr. Palmer, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I was unavoidably delayed by two hearings held simultaneously. I would like to be recorded on the, without objection, I would ask unanimous consent to be recorded as a no on the previous vote.
Okay, without objection, no on, yes on this vote, obviously, but no on which vote? On the amendment. Is that clear enough? We had three votes. Yeah.
You got enough to pass.
We know what you meant. Okay. Let me ask the clerk, can we go through those amendments and make sure that Mr. Palmer knows which amendments he's voting on? Is that possible? Let's get, can you all help him out? We need to,
Mr. Chairman, I was detained and was late for the vote on Ms. Johnson's amendment and
Okay.
request unanimous consent to be recorded as an aye on the amendment vote.
without objection, the gentlewoman will be recorded as an aye on the Johnson amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
And we're
Chairman.
still going to get clarification from Mr. Palmer here. Okay. Okay. We'll put Mr. Palmer's comments in the record, but for purposes of today, he was recorded as voting yes on final passage right now. Is that correct? Okay. Do we need to announce a recount on those previous votes? Considering the Bonamici vote yes for the Johnson amendment and the Palmer vote yes on final.
Sir, the final passage of S 141 was by voice vote.
Okay.
If Mr. Palmer would care to register his vote on Ms. Johnson's amendment to S 141?
Okay. And Mr. Palmer, is that a no on the Johnson amendment? Okay. Without objection?
Sir, the final vote on Ms. Johnson's amendment to S 141 is 20 members, 14 members voting yes, 20 members voting no.
Okay, great. If there's no further discussion, this completes our business, and this concludes the Science Committee markup. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.